aspects which we had not covered on the last occasion because of paucity of time. And the section that remained in relation to mens rea was in relation to the aspect of mens rea in relation to scenarios where the statute does not provide for one. If you recollect on the last date of hearing, I had concluded the lecture by trying to tell you people to evidence as to where all you will find the presence of mens rea as far as the penal code is concerned. I had spoken to you about the fact that you find it in various parts in every section, like the presence, omnipresence of God. In every provision I had said that you can locate it. But there are certain exceptions. It is not that it is completely available in every section of the penal code. To give you an example of an instance where it is not available would be section 292 subsection 1. If you people can open section 292 of the Indian Penal Code subsection 1 for a minute. Can I also open the same? Because this relates to dealing with pornographic material. Now, dealing with pornographic material, if you will see, subsection 1 talks about the exhibition and sale of the same. Now, in relation to the exhibition and sale of pornographic material, you will find that subsection 1 does not talk about the presence of any mens rea. If you will read 291 along with me, 291 says, just give me a minute, I am also, the print is a little small for me. Now 291 talks about 292 clause 1 talks about sale etc. of obscene books etc. For the purposes of subsection 2, a book, pamphlet, paper, writing, drawing, painting, representation, figure, or any other object shall be deemed to be obscene if it is lascivious or appeals to the prurient interest, or if its effect or where it comprises of two or more distinct items, the effect of any one of its items, if taken as a whole, such as to tend to deprave and corrupt persons who are likely, having regard to all relevant circumstances, to read, see or hear the matter contained or embodied in it. And then whoever A. sells, lets to hire, distributes, publicly exhibits, or in any manner puts into circulation, or for purposes of sale, hire, distribution, public exhibition, or circulation, makes, produces, or has in his possession any obscene book, pamphlet, paper, drawing, painting, representation, or figure, or any other obscene object whatsoever, and then the punishment is prescribed. So if you see that this particular section does not talk about the knowledge as far as the person is concerned who is having this particular, who is in possession of this particular material, or who is distributing this material, or who is exhibiting this material, or who is selling the said material, or putting this material to any kind of use. The mere possession of the said material out here without any mental construct of any kind is making it an offense per se. Now, when this is happening, you are finding a scenario where the statute is creating a kind of strict liability. Strict liability in the sense that it is devoid of any mens rea. It talks about a situation where there is no mens rea and yet there is an offense, because the statute is embodying it. Now the question is that whether in this kind of a scenario mere possession alone will be punishable or not. This matter came up before the Supreme Court in an old judgment, and the Supreme Court had the occasion to deal with this. And what did the Supreme Court say? The Supreme Court in that said judgment, where a person was found in possession of these books and was giving these books for the purposes of sale, putting it out for sale, the Supreme Court said that in this kind of a scenario, two things emerge. One, the purpose of the legislation was to prevent the circulation of this kind of material of prurient interest. And it would be too much to expect that you are trying to import a defense for the accused, wherein the prosecution will have to prove that he had knowledge of the fact that the material which was there within the books were obscene or pornographic. Let us look at it in a simple way. I am a simple vendor on the street and I am in the possession of books. I happen to be illiterate, but I make my money by the sale of books, which is normally what happens in this country. Now, if I am selling a book and within the said material is obscene, it's completely obscene, the written material, and I happen to be illiterate, it will be no defense on my part to say that I am illiterate, I do not know what I am selling out here. Because here the statute has brought in a prohibition. The Supreme Court says that in this kind of a scenario, we cannot import that mens rea of knowledge out here. Because here the question of the mental state of mind is knowledge alone. So the question is that, is the particular vendor expected to read the particular book and then sell it? When we go to a bookshop, is it that all the fellows who are selling books in a bookshop, they are expected to read the material which is there with them? It can never be so. In fact, I can guarantee you are finding so many books behind me right now, which I have purchased. I have not read all of them. Though there is a conscious purchase, but I have not read all of them. Most of us lawyers exhibit them for the clients. Though now you have moved into a different kind of world of connectivity where you don't need books at all. But earlier, the situation was that this is meant for client consumption, not for lawyer's consumption. So the same analogy we are drawing there. So that was a very interesting case which was decided by the Supreme Court. And the citation I can give you people, it is by the name of Ranjit D. Videshi versus State of Maharashtra. The name of the judgment is Ranjit D. Videshi versus State of Maharashtra. The exact citation you people can look up because I am quoting it out of some scant memory of having read it at some point of time. You see, a very interesting matter came up in our office also, somewhat similar to this. Of course, there were other aspects also in relation to it. Because in today's world, it is not books. Children are happy in all that toon material, isn't it? Comics and toon material. So there was this very famous comic, I think Siddharth also is aware because they happen to be known to him. So there, the printing of...
Saga.
What is the name?
The name was Saga.
Saga. Okay, there's a comic series.
The
By...
name,
comic series by the name of Saga. Now in that a similar situation happened. What they had done, they had given those comics for publication and as a matter of publicity, there was an exhibition which was held, and in the exhibition, in order to promote their products, they had held an exhibition in Bangalore, and in that exhibition they had distributed free material. It is not that they had sold anything. It was a free open kind of an exercise where people had come and they had freely distributed these set of comics for children there. But unfortunately, inside the comics, there were graphic descriptions of those toon comics where there were depictions of humans indulging in a sexual exercise. And this got distributed amongst children. And apparently, one of the parents who saw this material in the hands of the children took offense to it and filed a complaint. And the prosecution commenced. Now, here, there could have been no defense as far as the owners were concerned of the said comics. The owners were concerned of the said comics to say that we were unaware that this was not given in print by us, but we were unaware that it got printed. This could have never been a defense as far as the issues were concerned. So these kind of scenarios do crop up. Now going back to the basic aspect which I was dealing with, because this was one of the instances which I had shown from the Indian Penal Code itself, that the statute by itself did not require the presence of a mens rea, otherwise termed in law as strict liability, that the liability is strict and absolute. It is also called absolute liability or strict liability. So essentially, if the ingredients which are made out as far as the statute are concerned, minus the mental element, the very commission of the act or omission of what is to be done would bring it within the pale of an offense. This is what is the intention of the legislature here. Now, how did this law develop? For that, for a little while, we need to go back to English law and also to certain things. For instance, the concept of mens rea. I had spoken about the concept of mens rea initially. The concept of mens rea is that there has to be evil intent. There has to be criminal intent or evil intent. Otherwise, without that intent, there can be no criminal offense, is the basic fundamental principle. Now, all this started way back in England in 1875. There was a very interesting case by the name of Regina versus Prince Henry. Now, it was not the actual Prince Henry of those times. His name was Henry Prince, but it is the case is generally termed as Prince Henry. Now, what did Henry Prince do? He decided to carry on with a young girl, and in the carrying on activity, he decided to take her along with himself from the keeping of her lawful guardian. And this he did because the girl gave him an impression that she was 18 years of age, although at that point of time she was only 14. Now, the statute for taking a minor of the age of 14 or below from the lawful guardianship of her parents had made it an offense as such. The mere taking away was an offense. Now, when he was set up for trial, his defense in that trial was that she had represented to me that she was 18 years of age. She also looked to be 18 years of age. And I was under the bona fide belief that she was 18. And that is why I accompanied her. She decided, I told her and she accepted to come with me, and I accompanied her. So the defense was that of bona fide belief. Now, when this question came up before the bench unanimously came to an opinion saying this, that one, there was no such defense available to him because mens rea or the mental element, that what he considered at that point of time, that he was under a bona fide belief, that belief cannot be factored in. That belief cannot be factored in. And this was a scenario where strict liability or absolute liability was entailed, and therefore he was found to be guilty. Also, at the same time, while they were deciding this issue, this aspect also came into picture that not only had he done a legal wrong, he had also done a moral wrong. Now, why I am taking into that as far as consideration is concerned is because the moral wrong aspect was also the nature of the legislation. Because when we look into the development of the law subsequently and then how it applies in India, we will find that this has got some bearing. Now, having said this, in 1875, post 1875, because here was a scenario which went, in a way, according to me, even against the canons of what is laid down in the Bible. Because I go back to the Bible as far as this is concerned, because when Christ was crucified, at the time of the crucifixion, they say that he was crucified along with two thieves. And when he was crucified at that point of time, the crucifixion happened at the instance of the Jews. Because they refused, they did not want to believe that he was the Messiah. And interestingly, the Jews convinced the Roman governor at that point of time, Pontius Pilate, to carry out the crucifixion. So, on the order of Pontius Pilate, in deference to the wishes of the Jews, Christ was crucified. Now, when that crucifixion was happening, obviously there was no use of his clothes. So, the clothes that he was wearing, the slippers that he was wearing, and the effects that he was carrying on him, his personal effects, the Roman soldiers decided to distribute it amongst themselves. And he was put up on the cross and he was crucified. And at the time of crucifixion, it is generally stated, and as is evidenced probably from one of the books which was written at that point of time. I don't know what it is, not called a book, it is the sayings of St. Luke's. You find it there. The Gospel of St. Luke's. In the Gospel of St. Luke's, you find that they say that at that point of time, one of these principles was enunciated by the word of Christ when he said that, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. And this, of course, is a matter of interpretation, that whether it was said in relation to the Romans, or it also included the Jews, or it also included all those people who were involved and who also witnessed the crucifixion of Christ. So there are various religious interpretations to that, but I am concerned only with these words which were spoken by Christ, and that was that, forgive them, Father, for they do not know what they do. So keeping this from the Bible, I go a little further. And next interesting case which comes up before the English court, R versus Tolson. Now this R versus Tolson is a very interesting case, and this case finds certain attributes elsewhere also in Hindi cinema. I will deal with the Hindi cinema part. You want me to deal that first? I will deal that and come to R versus Tolson, or let us do R versus Tolson and come to Hindi cinema later. Now R versus Tolson was a scenario where this lady was graciously married to her husband, and her husband decided to go on a voyage. Now this voyage was towards the promised land then, which was America. So he boarded a ship and moved towards America. A year or two passed and there was no news about him. So Mrs. Tolson decided to inquire. She inquired from people around and also from the shipping line which had seen this man off. And she was given to understand that the ship was shipwrecked somewhere towards the Caribbean coast, and Tolson was no more. So having done this, 6 or 7 years down the line, Mrs. Tolson meets somebody else. And during the course of meeting him, she not only likes him, she also informs him of the tragedy in her life. And that person was cognizant of these events and both of them decide to get into matrimony. So they marry each other. Now, as Hindi cinema has it, suddenly, post their marriage, a few years down the line, original Mr. Tolson comes back. He was not shipwrecked and he is back. Now, unfortunately for Mrs. Tolson, the law in England, because this is the way of Christianity, that is why they say to get a divorce for a Christian is the most difficult thing to do. Because, like the Hindu Marriage Act, though the Hindu Marriage Act subsequently saw legislation and you could divorce your wife if you don't get along with her, the Christian Marriage Act believes the marriage to be a sacrament and there cannot be any ground of divorce but for adultery. So, therefore, there was a statute which was at that point of time enacted, and this statute was section 57 of this statute of the Offences Against Persons Act 1861. Now, this was a very interesting piece of legislation which said that during the lifetime of your spouse, whether husband or wife, you could not contract another marriage. Here was a legislation which also again at no point of time spoke about any aspect of the mental state. It just said this, that supposing you get married during the lifetime of your spouse, you are liable. So now Mrs. Tolson was faced with this kind of a scenario where this case went on against her. And here, in this case, Mrs. Tolson took this plea that, look, I did this in a bona fide belief that my husband was dead. Now here, for the first time, there was a shift. The courts of England considered her plea and then came to this conclusion that Mrs. Tolson had, in fact, done or protracted the second marriage under a mistake of fact. She had endeavored her level best. She had made all efforts to see. She was assured that the ship was wrecked and her husband was no more. She had also gone to the extent of intimating and informing her second husband in relation to the fate of the first. So therefore, if the original Mr. Tolson landed up here after so many years, there was a mistake. There was in fact a bona fide mistake on her part, and in a way she did not have the mens rea as far as the offence is concerned of bigamy. So here was imported the element of mens rea for the first point of time as a defense. Now interestingly, this case occurred in 1889. For those of you who will be interested in the citation, it is 1889, volume 3, QBD, page 168. So here, mistake of fact was brought in as a device. This kind of a scenario was also the basis of plots in literature as well. An example that comes to my mind is The Mayor of Casterbridge. In this book, a very interesting book, a similar kind of scenario emerges where the mayor marries twice and his life gets entangled in this, and the whole book relates to that. So whenever you get a chance, have a look at Mayor of Casterbridge, which will also give you an insight into the prevalent scenarios at that point of time as to how it was an offense and how people also managed to build plots in literature around this offense. Now, reverting from there to Indian cinema. In Indian cinema, a very interesting movie by the name of Daag came in the 70s, featuring Rajesh Khanna. Rajesh Khanna at that time was at the zenith of his career. And in that film, Rajesh Khanna initially gets married to Sharmila Tagore, post an affair. There is an attempt of rape which is made on Sharmila Tagore by his boss's son. And who else but Mr. Prem Chopra for that kind of a scene. And in that process, there is a fight which ensues between Rajesh Khanna and Prem Chopra, and Prem Chopra gets murdered. And Rajesh Khanna is faced with a trial and gets convicted in the said trial and is sentenced for a punishment of life, meets with an accident, and in the said accident, he manages to escape, all others die. So it is assumed that everybody had died in the said accident, and thus he gets a new life. And in this second life, he marries Raki. And interestingly, drawing from Mayor of Casterbridge, he also, since Raki is a very rich landlord's daughter, using those connections, and since she has an illegitimate child from one of her affairs, he decides to get married to her in order to grant legitimacy to that child, and is also in line to become the mayor of that particular city in which he settles. So the plot moves on. But of course, in this case there is a slight difference, because at no point of time the element of mens rea was ruled out, because here he consciously married her in order to hide his identity. This first wife again surfaces, and then there is a court scene. So that's how this movie Daag progresses. So I would just gave Daag as an example to show that how bigamy at various points has inspired various people. Not only the law, but also literature and cinema, which has drawn from this plot. And this element, this mental element of mens rea, has been the focus in each one of it. So that is what I am trying to draw to you as an example. So moving further from Daag, I come to the next matter, wherein there was a kind of a volte-face to this concept which was brought in way back in 1880s by R versus Tolson, in another interesting case, which was R versus wheat. Now in R versus wheat happens a kind of a scenario which you generally see, which I generally used to see when I used to practice in the trial courts of Delhi. Now, you may say that it is a scenario where lawyers have been exploiting the ignorance of clients, and a situation where the law says that ignorance of law is not an excuse, so it's an irony. Because I have had occasions where I have seen trial court lawyers, I am not naming anybody, but I have myself witnessed it, that a divorce deed is being prepared. And seriously, the client is convinced. The two of them come, we have had a fight, we don't want to live with each other, I can't withstand this Varun's face. He's a bloody Pahalwan, eats 40 rotis a day, so I don't need him. And he comes and the lawyer says, oh, no problem sir, I will get a divorce for you, it's not a big difficulty, but you'll have to procure papers. So they charge money, they procure papers from the treasury, some 500 rupees paper is procured, and some 5,000 is charged for that as well. And then a meticulous divorce deed is prepared. Right? All rights, apportioning of property, apportioning of wealth, everything is done. And then ceremoniously it is also notarized to give it that legal weight. Stamping is done, 15 stamps are stuck onto it, and a legal document has been prepared and it is handed over. And the client happily takes it, one copy to you, one copy to the wife, and both go their way, happily under the belief that they are divorced. Now the question is, I have seen it happening. A similar kind of situation happened in R versus wheat. Although divorce deeds were not prepared, but in England, the lawyer convinced his client that he has obtained a divorce decree. So based on that assurance, what does the client immediately do when he is in his youth? He is more than in a great hurry to get married again. So he goes and gets married again. And it so turns out that there was no decree obtained, and the prosecution ensues. in the same provisions which I had just cited before. But on this occasion, their lordships hold otherwise. They say here there is no mistake of fact. They say here it is a mistake of law. And it is no excuse, and you are punished. So these are the idiosyncrasies of law also, is what I would say. Because if you consider what happens in a scenario where everybody is illiterate and he has no option but to believe that the legal process is what has been initiated, and he has obtained a legal document before him which is, giving him what he had desired, and on that belief if he is acting, why should you term this as a mistake of law? So these are issues which you need to ponder on, but this is how it happened then. Now going from here, because what was laid down in R versus Tolson, that even in relation to a statute, if the statute does not talk about mens rea will be one of the defenses which will be available. Mens rea will be presumed. The presumption will be that there is mens rea, and it is for the prosecution to rebut it. That the statute did not have mens rea is for the prosecution to show. And how will the prosecution show that? That also R versus Tolson deals with. It says that the prosecution will either expressly rule out mens rea. The prosecution will show that the statute is expressly ruling out mens rea. There is no mens rea as the statute is saying so clearly in relation to the offence. Or it will do that by necessary implication. So this onus or this burden is on the prosecution. Otherwise, the presumption will be that even if the statute does not talk about mens rea will be assumed. Now this was what the law, as it was laid down in R versus Tolson, as it stood in 1880s, which unfortunately witnessed a change thereafter when the next case which I had spoken about, R versus Wheat, came up. Now interestingly, all this confusion, because these confusions continued to prevail, and when these confusions continued to prevail, in 1946, in Brand versus Wood, there was a landmark judgment in which Justice Godard, he came up with a brilliant principle, which I say brilliant because I happen to be a defense lawyer, and which all of you will also concur at this point of time, till such time that you don't become a prosecutor or a judge. I am sure you will agree to this proposition. And what Justice Godard said, he reiterated what was said in Tolson, but he added one more line. That one more line that he added is very important from the point of view of a defense lawyer. He said that if the courts, one, it is not expected of the courts to do away with the principle of mens rea if the legislature does not include it. And further, it is important to do it in this fashion because it will safeguard the personal liberty. It's a question of safeguarding the personal liberty of the subject. And that is why it is important for a defense lawyer, because if this rule is interpreted in any other way, it will result in deprivation of personal liberty and nothing more and nothing less. So Brand versus Wood was a landmark judgment to that extent, that it emphasized on the aspect of personal liberty and emphasized on the aspect that mens rea will be imported into a statute till such time that the statute does not either expressly decree that mens rea will not be taken into question, or by necessary implication it cannot be brought in. So therefore, this was a shift. And this is the law which is holding this way in England also as per till date. the same thing gets imported into India. Because now I have dealt with the progression of this aspect of mens rea till this point of time. I move on to the Indian situation. And as far as the Indian situation is concerned, the first landmark judgment wherein a situation like this came into picture came in a judgment by the name of State versus Hans Mayer George. The judgment is of the year 1962. The citation would be 1965, I stand corrected. AIR 1965, Supreme Court 732. Now, this was again a very interesting case, and this related to the provisions of FERA as it stood in 1947, as it stood in 1965, Foreign Exchange Regulation Act. Now, Hans Mayer George was going to travel to India on the date was probably 7th of November 1965, when he decided to board a plane from Zurich to India, and from India he was on his way to Singapore. So he was not going to disembark in India. He was going to be sitting in the plane, and he was en route to move to Singapore. Now, having talked about his travel itinerary, he had, at the time when he was starting from Zurich, at that time he decided to get along with him 6 or 7 gold bars. Now, Vaibhav is having a smile. It is not like our man. Our man had 10 kilograms of gold here in India itself. So anyway, so he decided to bring in around 6 or 7 bars of gold from Zurich, because the standard of gold in Zurich is of international standard and repute. So he got bullion from there, and he was en route to Singapore. FERA regulations till 5th of November did not prohibit the import of gold from outside to the country. Now, on till the 7th, in fact, the day when he boarded the flight, a day prior to that, the government of India brought in a new set of regulations under FERA and said that the import of gold into India would amount to an offence. Now, Hans Mayer George was on the plane. He lands in Bombay, transit. There is a search conducted in the plane, and he is caught with these bars, and he is prosecuted. So all the questions come up before this court also. One, here the statute did not provide for mens rea. Whether mens rea could be imported as per Brand versus Wood. All these issues came up before the Supreme Court at that point of time. The Supreme Court, in its wisdom, now when I say wisdom, I say wisdom as you say in wisdom, anyway, we have to accept it, said that yes, mens rea is very important. That without mens rea, there is no offence. This was a definite ruling which they gave. However, it did not help Hans Mayer George. Because here was a scenario where he did not have mens rea, he did not know that the law would change on the way, that there would be strict liability of this kind. The Honorable Supreme Court then, thereafter, went into an analysis of the statute. Now, here comes the tricky part. They decided to employ the tests. They accepted Brand versus Wood also. They said, brilliant, we accept this. Now let us apply Brand versus Wood. Now let us see whether the regulation in itself has got any such thing to it which expressly bars mens rea, number one. Number two, let us also look into this, that what is the nature of this legislation, because you have to go into the implication part, whether it exists, whether there is a bar to mens rea directly. The Supreme Court said no, directly there is no such bar to mens rea out here. So then we go to the second part, by necessary implication, whether we can say that mens rea will not be imported into a situation like this. And here, unfortunately for Hans Mayer George, they came up with this, that by necessary implication, this piece of legislation or this piece of regulation has been brought, one, in order to prevent smuggling. Those were the days of Haji Mastan. Okay, so smuggling gold was a big thing. So Haji Mastan had grown in activity. The gangs in Bombay were active, and it was gold on which they thrived, because they used to bring gold from Arabia by sea. Here George came from Switzerland by plane, but all the same he brought gold. So therefore the object, one, we have to see the object. What does the object of the act say? The object of the act says that this FERA is meant for the purposes of preventing smuggling. So there is that object which needs to be achieved. Two, when we look into the provisions, we find that nowhere in the provision do you find a word knowingly. The word knowingly doesn't exist. If the word knowingly doesn't exist, which means that the element of knowledge has been done away with. Mere possession alone is enough. And what we have brought will now qualify as a contraband. So they brought in these parameters to show that by necessary implication, the law had changed, and by necessary implication, mens rea, as far as mens rea is concerned, mens rea will be out of the picture. So for that, the tests that they enumerated were fourfold. One, they said that we will examine the phraseology of the statute, that how it is phrased. How it is phrased, to the extent that how is strict liability phrased in it. Then we will also look into it as to whether it is phrased in such a fashion that it excludes the mental element, the culpable mind. Second, of course, as I had stated, they said that they would look into the object of the statute. And then they said that we will also see that what is the nature of the public purpose which is sought to be attained. And the fourth test on which they based this test, the fourth aspect on which they based this test was based on what is known as the mischief rule. When you go to the aspects of statutory interpretation, you will find that the mischief rule is a very interesting rule, which says that you look into the legislation in such a way to see that what is the mischief that this legislation intended to curb. So here, what the mischief it intended to curb was smuggling. And then, along with this, the Supreme Court said that we also need to test it in relation to the fact as to whether strict liability which is being brought suppresses this mischief. So they came to the conclusion that yes, in relation to smuggling, to do away with mens rea and keep the offence as a strict liability offence suppresses the mischief, and therefore Hans Mayer George cannot be let go. So this is what happened with Hans Mayer George. Hans Mayer George's incarceration resulted in the development of this law. So this is how strict liability in India needs to be interpreted. One, the principles are the same. Brand versus Wood, the principle which was developed in Brand versus Wood, applies even in India. Even if the statute does not talk about mens rea will be assumed as a defense, will be assumed or presumed by the court. It will be on the onus will shift on the prosecution in order to bring in these two aspects. Either the statute should say categorically that mens rea will not be attracted, or by necessary implication it will be ruled out. So these two tests need to be met. Otherwise, all the defenses which are available in terms of mens rea will be available to you. When I say all the defenses, your mind should immediately go back to the general exceptions of the Indian Penal Code. Because those exceptions not only relate to every provision of the Indian Penal Code, they also extend to local laws and special laws. So the element of mens rea is imported from there. And that is why they are general exceptions. And that is why I started the lecture initially with the fundamental premise that the Indian Penal Code is the general law. So all those exceptions will get imported, will be available to you as defenses. So having said that, there was another very interesting case where the Supreme Court, and generally in criminal law these kind of situations do come, legislations get passed. Now this particular case, which was titled by the name of Inder Sen versus State of Punjab. Now this Inder Sen versus State of Punjab was a decision which the Supreme Court gave probably in 1973. But this particular decision pertained to provisions of the Opium Act. Now the Opium Act again is a very old act. If my memory serves me right, it goes back to 1870s. That was the time when the opium trade was on. India was at that time, the British in fact had exploited India in terms of the cultivation of opium. Opium was essentially, there were in fact opium wars, which were the famous opium wars related because of all this which went from here to China. It is not that China alone gave something here, we also sent something there. Now today they have sent the virus, that time we sent opium. So anyway, saying that, and interestingly at that time opium in India had a very interesting name to it. I don't know how many of you know it. In local parlance, opium is called Chandu. In local criminal parlance, opium is called Chandu. Chandu hai tere paas, which means that you have opium with you. So now, opium, apart from the fact that it has various uses to it, it has got medicinal uses also to it, and it is also used in surgery to alleviate pain. So there are many aspects to it. But the Act of 1870, Section 9 in that said Act, talked about the possession of opium to be per se an offence. And Section 10 in that said Act created a scenario where there was a presumption created that anybody who is dealing with opium will be presumed to have committed an offence under Section 9 unless he can prove otherwise. And what he can prove otherwise? Unless he can prove otherwise that the opium was not knowingly in his possession, or other circumstances existed to explain the presence of that opium. So here is a legislation which is somewhat different. Here, though it is making, Section 9 is making or creating a scenario where mere possession alone is an offense. But then, section 10, when you read section 10, section 10 is bringing in the element of mens rea. So, when the Supreme Court went into this, now to the facts of this case, what happened? Now, Mr. Inder Sen was a trader. Some apples were booked from Mr. Sood's land. And the bilty had come that there is a box of apples coming. And Mr. Sen went to the station to collect it, handed over the receipt, and the parcels were given to him. And when he received the parcels, there was a raid conducted. And when the raid was conducted, they were found that there were few apples and more apples of opium, chandu. There were balls of chandu along with apples. So he was charged and the trial started. Now some brilliant lawyer like me, if I may say so, decided to take an offer defense that I am innocent. I do not know what has happened. I never came to take this. Yeah, I just simply falsely denied. I have been falsely implicated. I have nothing to do. Supreme Court said, okay, fine. The question is not this. It is not that you cannot have a defense. Mens rea is there. You could have, but this mens rea is on to you. Here the burden of proof will shift to you. The burden of proof which will shift to you is for you to show that you did not have knowledge as to what was there apart from apples. You did not discharge that. You took a defense saying this, that I do not know. You took a defense even denying the apples which were there in it. So in that kind of a scenario, he was held guilty. So when we go and launch into trials wherein strict liability is involved, we also need to carefully look into the provisions, how we are to deal with it, what sort of defense we need to take. Because if we take this Chandu defense, then Tihar is waiting. So this Inder Sen I had cited only for this purpose, that what a wrong defense can also do. Every criminal lawyer worth his salt has taken wrong defenses and regretted it and waited for a situation where he could better that. So this is a part of learning. That's why it is called trial. You keep trying. Okay. So having talked about this, I more or less come to the conclusion of this entire subject on mens rea.
One more thing, sir.
Yes.
Sir, there is prevention of this
Yes.
Food
Now,
Adulteration Act also.
yes. So again, Food Adulteration Act. So as I said,
Section
what is the object of the legislation? The object of the legislation brings in the element of strict liability. In scenarios like the Food Adulteration Act, again, there the element of mens rea is taken away on the same principle of Hans Mayer George. That here there is a,
even storing.
yes, here there is a public welfare purpose. And here a duty is enjoined on the person who is dealing with those kind of items to see that he deals with them in accordance with the provisions. That duty is enjoined on him. So therefore, food adulteration cases are again a little difficult to handle. Because when I did those trials for the first time, I was finding it difficult to digest. Here I have done nothing. Right? Some food inspector comes and takes a sample. I am not even there. I am the owner of the said premises and now I have got to bloody face a trial. And a trial what for? He will say, he will take that and he will come with a standard saying this, that the amount of fat content was 2% less than what it should actually be. But yes, the law enjoins that. If it is 2% less, you will go to prison. So you need to challenge the report. So those technical defenses come up there. Right? You cannot blame the doodh wala who gave you the milk. that I purchased the milk from the said Doodhwala and I do not know what he gave me. That cannot be a defense. As a reference to context, I am telling you.
Storing is an offense.
Mere possession. That standard is imported onto you. You have to maintain that standard. So that is why I am giving you that hint. So don't take the defense that I got that from that fellow. He sold that to me. If you take that defense, you are done for. So with this, we will end the topic on mens rea. We have dwelled much on the mind, and I leave it to you thereafter to go through the citations and go through the judgments to get a better insight. We will move on further from here to actus reus, the other elements of crime which I started with. So we will, in the next session, we will move on to actus reus and then the effect of actus reus on human conduct, on humans. Now these two aspects I will deal with, and with that this section in relation to crime will conclude. Thank you very much all of you for being patient with me. Till the next lesson, bye bye.